Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a question that really gets to the heart of things, doesn't it? It's from this AI analysis we've been digging into. It asks, why is it that most people, whether historically slaves or just the average hardworking person today, why are they kept within these limits? Limits on wealth, power, education, even health?
It's a huge question, and a really important one, because this deep dive, it's not looking at just random unfairness.
Right.
Our sources, this AI-driven scientific analysis, they're talking about something called the enduring architecture of human inequality.
Yeah.
The idea is that inequality isn't, an accident.
Okay.
It's structured, it's deep, it reinforces itself.
Yeah.
And it's shaped human life, everywhere, across cultures.
So our job today, then, is to really unpack that, this architecture. The core idea, it seems, is that the system actively creates and keeps these divisions going, right? Concentrating advantages for a few.
Exactly. And understanding that architecture, that's the crucial first step. If you want a more equitable future, you have to see the blueprint first.
Which brings up the timing. Why now? Why is this so urgent?
Well, a big part of it is artificial intelligence, AI. It's got this dual potential, you see.
How so?
It could turbocharge these inequality engines, make the divides even bigger, more rigid than anything we've seen. Or, if we're smart about it, if we intervene deliberately, it could actually become a tool to help dismantle the very limits it might otherwise amplify. It's a massive fork in the road.
Okay, so for you listening, what's the journey here?
Yeah.
First, we'll look back, trace the history, ancient slavery, feudalism, class systems. How did we get here? Then we'll break down the modern engines that keep it all going today.
Yeah.
Economic, political, social stuff, ideology.
The mechanisms, yeah.
After that, we look at the impact, the real-world consequences on people's bodies, on society, the whole global picture.
Right, the lived experience.
And finally, we'll think about the future. Questions of justice, how we govern ourselves, and where AI fits into maybe building something more equitable.
It's not just theory.
No, exactly. This stuff, this knowledge, it's like a shortcut to understanding the forces shaping your world, your chances in life, maybe even how long you live. You might have a few aha moments.
Hopefully.
Okay, let's dive in. Part 1, the deep roots of inequality. These limits we're feeling today. They're not new, are they? They're echoes from way back.
Oh, absolutely. Echoes from the very beginning, really. The seeds were planted way back in the Neolithic Revolution.
When we started farming.
Exactly.
Yeah.
When humans settled down, started farming, suddenly you had surplus food, private property, owning land. That shift, it changed everything. It laid the groundwork for structured inequality.
And it got written down pretty early.
Incredibly early. Look at the Code of Hammurabi. Millennia ago, it explicitly recognizes slavery, formalizes it, shows that right from the start, legal systems were being used to, lock inequality into place.
Wow, so it wasn't just like a side effect of things, it was built in.
It seems so. And then in classical antiquity, you get the first real slave societies.
Yeah.
Places where slavery wasn't just present, it was the main labor force.
Yeah, Greece and Rome.
Yeah. Think ancient Athens, maybe half the population enslaved. Working silver mines, farms, freeing up citizens for politics, philosophy, or the Roman Empire. Some estimates suggest more than half the people in the city of Rome were enslaved. Working the huge farms, the latifundia, doing domestic work, it was foundational to their whole way of life.
It's hard to even picture a society built like that. So when Rome fell, did that structure just vanish, or did it just change shape?
It adapted. It changed shape. You get feudalism mostly in Europe from around the 9th to 15th centuries.
Yeah.
That was a new architecture.
Right, the pyramid, king at the top.
King, then nobles getting land feasts, then vassals, knights.
And holding it all up?
Well,
The serfs, the unfree majority.
exactly. Serfs or villeins. They weren't quite property like slaves. Couldn't be bought and sold like chattel. But they were legally tied to the land. Couldn't leave without the Lord's say-so.
Right,
They had
right.
to work the Lord's land, give him produce. So while they weren't owned outright, functionally, they were often treated not much better than slaves. It shows how the mechanism shifts from owning bodies to controlling the land you need to survive, but the core pattern persists. Small, elite, large, unfree labor force.
That's a really clear example of how these inequality patterns adapt. Now, outside Europe, the sources point to another incredibly rigid system based purely on birth, the caste system in India.
Yeah, the Indian caste system is, historically, one of the most rigid hierarchies ever devised. It's based on two key ideas, Varna and Jati.
Okay, what are those?
Varna is the broad framework, 4 main groups, Brahmins, priests, scholars at the top, down to Shudras laborers, and then outside, below that, the Dalits, historically called untouchables, doing the most impure jobs.
And Shadi is more specific. How does that affect daily life?
Jati. There are thousands of those. They're distinct communities you're born into, each traditionally linked to an occupation. Your Jati basically decided your job, your social standing, who you could marry, everything. Made moving up almost impossible.
Wow, and its origins go way back.
To the Vedic period, yes. But, and this is crucial, British colonial rule really formalized it, weaponized it even. They used censuses, relied on high caste informants. They ended up entrenching the inequalities much deeper. And even though it's legally banned now, its legacy, it still has a massive impact in India today.
So we see these deep patterns. Then comes another huge shift. The Industrial Revolution, late 18th century onwards, mass movement to cities, forging a whole new kind of class system.
Totally transformed society. You get two main new classes emerging. First, the industrial middle class, the bourgeoisie. They own the factories, the mines, the capital. Got incredibly wealthy and powerful.
And the other side?
The urban working class. The proletariat. Millions poured into cities from the countryside. Former farmers, artisans, they had no land, no capital. All they could do was sell their labor for wages. They became, cogs in the new industrial machine.
And the conditions were brutal, weren't they? Dangerous factories, crazy long hours, child labor, living in squalor.
Awful conditions, absolutely. Dangerous, unsanitary, overcrowded tenements. Disease like cholera was rampant. But that shared hardship, that stark difference between their lives and the factory owners, it forged a new kind of awareness, class consciousness.
People started seeing themselves as a group, leading to things like the Luddite smashing machines.
Exactly. Organized resistance started. And alongside this, you get a really important ideological shift, the birth of the myth of meritocracy.
The idea that success is all down to individual talent and hard work.
Right. And the bourgeoisie, the owners, they really leaned into this.
How so? How did they use that idea?
They used it to justify their own wealth, to make it seem earned, deserved, and crucially, to blame poverty on the poor themselves. Laziness, drunkenness, moral failing, not the system.
So it frames inequality as natural, even just.
Precisely. And that narrative, that way of thinking, it's still incredibly powerful in shaping debates about inequality today.
But hang on, isn't there an argument that you need some inequality?
Yeah.
To drive innovation, reward risk-taking? How did the sources handle that?
That's a fair point to raise. The sources generally suggest that while, yes, incentives matter, the extreme levels of inequality we often see aren't some natural requirement for progress. They're more the outcome of these specific structures we're talking about.
Okay. So looking back at these historical systems, slavery, feudalism, caste, the industrial class system, they all divided people hierarchically.
Yeah, that's the common thread. Different methods, different justifications. Slavery used brute force. Legal ownership justified by natural hierarchy. Feudalism controlled land, used divine right. Caste used birth, religion, social exclusion. The industrial system used wage labor, justified by meritocracy.
It really shows how adaptive these systems are, always finding new ways to maintain control and make it seem legitimate.
Which brings us right up to today. These historical forms, they've evolved into what our sources call the modern engines of inequality. How the limits are maintained now. Let's get into those in part two.
Okay, part two. The engines of modern inequality. So how does it work today?
Well, at the core is the economic engine. How wealth is made, shared out, and crucially concentrated. You had classical thinkers like Marx focusing on who owns the factories, the means of production. Then Max Weber broadened it out. It's not just ownership, it's also your market position, social status, political clout.
Right. But then more recently, Thomas Piketty came up with that simple, powerful formula, RG. What does that tell us?
Piketty's RG, it's stark. It basically says the rate of return you get from owning capital investments, property, assets, historically tends to grow faster than the overall economy.
So money makes money faster than people earn it through working?
In essence, yes. It means wealth that's already accumulated, especially inherited wealth, tends to grow faster than wages or economic output. It's a fundamental engine driving wealth concentration. It helps explain why just working harder often doesn't close the gap with those who own capital. Piketty's data clearly shows wealth concentration dropping in the mid-20th century, then sharply rising again since the 1980s in many Western countries, that U-shape.
Okay, so capital grows faster. But surely some wealth concentration is just, the free market working, rewarding innovators, people who take risks. How does Piketty's ideas square with that?
That's the standard defense, isn't it? But Piketty's work An analysis from groups like Oxfam really challenged that. Oxfam found something staggering. Around 60% of billionaire wealth today isn't earned in that classic entrepreneurial sense.
60%. Where does it come from then?
Inheritance, monopoly power controlling markets, and cronyism, basically cozy relationships with the state. Get this. In 2023, for the first time, more new billionaires got their wealth through inheritance than by starting businesses.
Wow. So it's often taken, not made, as the source puts it.
Yeah, captured through structures, connections, anti-competitive practices, not just productive investment or innovation. It complicates that simple free market reward story significantly.
It really does. So how do we measure this stuff? You mentioned the Gini coefficient.
Right, the Gini coefficient. It's a standard tool, basically a number between 0 and 1. 0 means perfect equality. Everyone has the same income. 1 means perfect inequality. One person has everything.
And where do countries typically fall?
Well, it varies. The U.S., for example, has a Gini coefficient over 0.4, which is pretty high for a developed nation. Many European countries are lower, maybe in the 0.24 to 0.36 range. It gives us a snapshot of how unequal the income distribution is.
Okay, so that's the economic engine. But it doesn't work alone, right? It's tied to the political engine.
Inextricably linked. C. Wright Mills, back in the 50s, talked about the power elite. It's a really useful idea here.
What's the power elite?
Mills argued that real power isn't dispersed. It's concentrated in a small, fairly unified group of people at the top of big corporations, the military and the federal government. They share similar backgrounds, they know each other, they move between these top positions.
A revolving door?
Sort of, yeah. It's not some secret conspiracy, more a structural reality. And it's the key mechanism for turning economic power, wealth, into political power.
Through things like campaign donations, lobbying.
Exactly. Money buys access, influences policy, ensures the priorities of the wealthy get heard, often get legislated. And the legal system itself is a massive player.
How so?
Laws can lock in inequality. Think of historical examples like segregation laws, redlining that prevented minorities from getting mortgages in certain areas. Or think today about tax laws that favor income from capital over income from labor. Even access to justice, affording good lawyers, navigating the system is unequal.
But laws can also fight inequality.
Absolutely. Landmark laws like the Civil Rights Act or Voting Rights Act showed the state can be a force for dismantling inequality. The point is, the state isn't neutral. It's actively shaping the outcome, one way or the other.
So it becomes a loop. Wealth buys influence. Influence shapes laws to protect and grow wealth, which creates more resources for influence.
You got it. A self-reinforcing loop. It shows the state isn't just a bystander, it's a key part of the architecture.
Okay, loop acknowledged. Let's move to the social engine. Networks, norms, institutions.
Right. This engine works through less visible structures, our social networks, cultural expectations, and big institutions like the education system. It's how advantage and disadvantage get passed down, sometimes even more effectively than cash.
Social networks. You mean like who you know?
Yeah. Mark Granovetter had this famous idea, the strength of weak ties. It's often not your close friends, but your acquaintances, who connect you to new opportunities, jobs, information.
But not everyone has the same access to those valuable weak ties, right? Because of, what was it, homophily?
Exactly. Homophily, the fact that we tend to hang out with people similar to ourselves. Rich with rich, poor with poor, people with similar education levels together. It's a really robust pattern.
And that creates?
It creates cumulative advantage. If you start with advantages, say, being born into a wealthy, well-connected family, your network multiplies those advantages. You get access to mentors, internships, insider knowledge. Pierre Bourdieu called this social capital.
Like a hidden currency.
Pretty much. The elite have tons of it, and they pass it on. Meanwhile, if you're in a resource-poor network, disadvantage gets compounded too. So the limits aren't just financial, they're social. Who you know locks you in or locks you out.
And schools play a big role in reinforcing this. Education is supposed to be the great equalizer.
Supposed to be. But often it ends up reproducing the hierarchy. The sources point to a few ways this happens. Unequal funding is a big one. Schools in poorer districts just have fewer resources. Then there's tracking, putting kids, often based on biased assumptions, onto different academic paths. Lower expectations for some groups, even biased curricula or standardized tests that don't resonate with kids from marginalized backgrounds.
So the system ends up filtering kids based on where they started?
To a large extent, yes. It channels some towards elite universities and careers, while limiting the pathways for others. It's a powerful sorting mechanism.
Okay. Final engine. The ideological one. This is about the stories we tell ourselves, justifying the whole setup.
Precisely. For any unequal system to last, people have to believe it's legitimate, or at least unavoidable. It needs an ideology.
We saw historical examples, Aristotle on slavery being natural, divine right of kings.
Right. Even early Christian teachings, though complex, could sometimes be interpreted to encourage acceptance of suffering in this life for rewards in the next. But a really potent and dangerous modern example was eugenics.
Eugenics
Yeah.
is chilling. It dressed up prejudice as science, didn't it?
It absolutely did. It was this pseudoscientific, deeply immoral theory about improving the human race by controlling breeding. It wrongly claimed that everything, intelligence, poverty, criminality, was basically hardwired, hereditary, born into your station.
And the consequences were horrific.
Devastating. It led directly to things like anti-miscegenation laws forbidding interracial marriage, harsh anti-immigration policies targeting undesirable groups, and forced sterilization. In the U.S. alone, over 64,000 people were sterilized against their will, disproportionately poor people, people with disabilities, women of color. And chillingly, Nazi Germany took inspiration from eugenics programs in the U.S. and elsewhere.
A really dark chapter. But after World War II, those kinds of overt biological justifications for inequality became, well, unacceptable. How did the ideological engine adapt then?
It got subtler, more covert. It shifted towards cognitive biases.
Mental shortcuts.
Yes, systematic patterns of deviation from rational judgment. These biases lead to stereotypes, the beliefs we hold about groups, prejudice the feelings, often negative, and discrimination the actions.
What kind of biases?
Things like confirmation bias, we look for evidence that confirms what we already believe and ignore evidence that doesn't. Or the actor-observer bias, when we mess up, it's because of the situation. When someone else messes up, it's because of their character. These happen unconsciously. They allow discriminatory attitudes and actions to persist, even when people consciously reject racism or sexism.
So it's more insidious now, harder to pin down.
Much harder. Because it operates below the level of conscious belief, it's tougher to challenge than an overt, explicit ideology like eugenics.
Okay, so if we pull back, all these modern theories, Marx on economics, Weber adding status and power, Mills on the elite, Piketty on RG, Bourdieu and Granovetter on social capital and networks, they each give us a piece of the puzzle.
Right. Each one highlights a different mechanism, economic, political, social, ideological, that works to maintain those limits on the majority. It's a complex, interlocking system.
Now, we've looked at the how. Let's turn to part 3, the lived experience. What does all this actually do to people? It's sobering seeing these patterns repeat, isn't it? Makes you wonder how much really changes deep down.
It does. And perhaps the most shocking impact, the most direct, is on our biology. Inequality literally gets under the skin. It is, fundamentally, a public health crisis.
Oh, so?
The World Health Organization talks about the social determinants of health. Basically, the conditions you're born into, grow up in, live, work, and age in. Those are the main drivers of your health, often more important than your genes or even the health care you receive.
And this shows up as the social gradient. That term came up.
Exactly, the social gradient. It's this consistent finding everywhere. The lower you are on the socioeconomic ladder, the worse your health outcomes tend to be. And it's not just rich versus poor. It's a gradient. Every step down matters.
The life expectancy gaps are just huge.
They're staggering. Globally, you can see gaps as wide as 33 years between the richest and poorest countries. Kids in low-income countries are 13 times more likely to die before they turn 5.
And even within rich countries.
Huge gaps. In the U.S., the richest men live about 15 years longer than the poorest men. It's 10 years for women. You can find places just a few hundred miles apart, like Loudoun County in Virginia and McDowell County in West Virginia, with a 15-year difference in average life expectancy.
15 years? Why? What are the mechanisms?
Well, part of it is material stuff, lack of access to good food, safe housing, healthcare, but a huge part is psychosocial, chronic stress, financial insecurity, experiencing discrimination, lack of control over your life. This stuff accumulates. It causes weathering, basically.
Yeah.
Chronic stress prematurely ages the body at a cellular level, leads to higher rates of heart disease, diabetes, all sorts of problems.
So the limits aren't just on your bank balance. They're literally carved into your cells, determining how long and how well you live.
That's the stark reality of it.
And beyond the body, inequality eats away at the social fabric too, doesn't it? Trust, cohesion.
Oh, definitely. Research consistently finds a strong link. Higher income inequality in a society correlates with lower levels of social trust. People trust each other less, and they trust institutions, government, media, the courts less too.
Which creates, what? A feeling of disconnection?
It can lead to what the sociologist Emil Durkheim called Anomie. It's a sense of normlessness, social instability. Where the rules feel broken, values break down, people feel alienated, disconnected, especially those who feel left behind by the system.
And that feeling, it can be exploited, fuel division.
Absolutely. Anomie makes societies vulnerable. Political polarization gets worse. Scapegoating becomes easier. Economic anxiety often gets misdirected. Instead of looking up at the elites running the system, people get encouraged to blame immigrants or minorities or whoever is designated as the other.
So the culture wars we hear so much about might actually be symptoms of deep economic inequality.
That's a strong argument made in the sources, yes. Extreme inequality fractures the sense of shared fate, the social contract. If people feel the system is rigged, that the rich aren't paying their fair share, they become less willing to cooperate, less willing to follow the rules. Why play the game if it's fixed?
Looking globally, then, it's a picture of extremes.
Stark extremes. You've got nearly 700 million people still living in extreme poverty, less than $2 15 times a day. And progress on reducing that number has basically stalled.
While at the other end.
Exploding wealth.
Yeah.
The 5 richest men in the world have seen their wealth double since 2020. 5 billion people got poorer in that same period. The richest 1% captured almost twice as much new wealth as the entire bottom 99% combined. We're talking about projections of the world's first trillionaire within a decade.
That is just hard to comprehend, and Oxfam connects this back to history, to colonialism.
They make a compelling case that today's global inequality isn't just a recent phenomenon, but deeply rooted in the extractive economic systems set up during the colonial era. Those patterns persist, they argue, through things like international debt, unfair trade rules, the power of multinational corporations, a kind of modern-day colonialism.
Wow, like the figure about the global south paying millions an hour to the richest 1% through the financial system?
Yeah, figures like that really highlight the ongoing extraction.
All of which puts the UN's goal SDG 10, reducing inequality, in serious trouble.
Deep trouble. The pandemic actually caused the biggest increase in inequality between countries in 3 decades. It created this 2-speed recovery, widening the gap. Failing on SDG 10 isn't just a statistical issue. It undermines everything else: poverty reduction, peace, stability. The sheer paradox: poverty stuck for billions while wealth explodes for a few shows. The global economic engine is fundamentally broken for most people.
Okay. We've seen the concentration, the unearned wealth, the poverty, the health gaps, the challenge to global goals. That leads us to part 4. Charting the future. How do we even think about fixing this? What's a just society? How do we get leaders who care? And what about AI?
These are the huge questions, and it starts with defining justice. What do we even mean by social justice? Generally, it's seen as having 2 parts: a goal, fair participation, fair sharing of resources, and a process making decisions democratically, inclusively.
Philosophically, there's some big ideas here. John Rawls.
Rawls is hugely influential. His theory, justice is fairness, asks us to do a thought experiment. Imagine designing society from behind a veil of ignorance.
Meaning you don't know who you'll be in that society. Rich, poor, talented, not.
Exactly. You choose the rules without knowing your own place.
Wow.
Rawls argued that from this impartial original position, rational people would agree on 2 main principles. First, the liberty principle. Everyone gets the same basic freedoms. Second, inequalities are only okay if 2 conditions are met. 1, fair equality of opportunity, jobs, and positions open to everyone, with real support, like education funding, to make it fair. 2, the difference principle.
The difference principle.
This is key. It says any inequalities that do exist must benefit the least advantaged members of society the most. It sort of treats natural talents, things you're born with, as a common asset whose benefits should be shared to some extent.
So for Rawls, inequality you didn't earn is fundamentally unfair and needs justifying by how it helps those at the bottom. But then there's the counter-argument from Robert Nozick.
Right. Nozick offers a strong libertarian challenge with his entitlement theory. He completely rejects focusing on the pattern of distribution, who has what. For Nozick, it's all about the history of how people got what they have.
So how you acquired it is all that matters.
Pretty much. He has 3 principles: justice in acquisition, how you first get something unowned; justice in transfer, voluntary exchanges, gifts, inheritance; and rectification of injustice, fixing past wrongs in acquisition or transfer. If you got something justly according to the first 2, it's yours, period.
And he famously argued taxing earnings is like forced labor.
Yes. His argument is that taking someone's earnings through taxes to give to someone else is violating their right to their own labor. His Wilt Chamberlain example makes this point. If millions freely choose to pay extra to watch a basketball star, The resulting inequality is perfectly just, and taxing will to redistribute is wrong.
They seem fundamentally opposed. Rawls focusing on fairness of outcome, Nozick on legitimacy of process. Can that gap even be bridged?
It seems vast. But the source offers an interesting thought. It points out that a lot of today's extreme wealth, the stuff Oxfam highlights from cronyism, monopolies, maybe even massive inherited fortunes passed down generations, arguably violates the spirit of Nozick's own principles. Was the acquisition really just? Was the transfer free from coercion or unfair advantage created by past injustices?
So maybe things like breaking up monopolies or taxing huge inheritances aren't unjust redistribution.
But acts of rectification, in Nozick's own terms. Correcting for past or ongoing injustices in how wealth is accumulated or transferred, it's a potential way to reconcile these views, suggesting just some interventions might be justifiable even from a libertarian perspective if the starting point isn't truly just.
That's a really interesting angle. It shifts the debate, which then leads to leadership. How do we get leaders who would actually pursue any kind of justice, whether Rawlsian or rectified Nozickian?
Well, the leaders we choose, they reflect what we value as a society, right? What's our theory of justice? And we need to think about the type of leadership, transactional versus transformational.
What's the difference?
Transactional is about exchange. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. Rewards, punishments. Transformational leaders think someone like Nelson Mandela, they inspire people, empower them. They get people to look beyond their own self-interest towards a bigger shared goal, serving the public good.
So for real change towards equity, we need more transformational leaders.
That's the argument. And we need systems, equitable governance models to support that.
What does that look like in practice?
Things like ensuring genuine participation, especially from marginalized groups whose voices are often ignored. Transparency, accountability leaders have to answer for their decisions, using data to actually see where disparities are and target interventions, and actively working to rectify past injustices like the civil rights movement did.
It sounds like it requires a whole cultural shift, though, not just policies.
Absolutely. Creating a proper culture for leadership means society itself has to start valuing equity, fairness, the common good as primary goals of governing, not just economic growth at any cost.
Okay. And now for the elephant in the room. AI. The big disruption. Is it going to make everything worse, or could it actually help?
It's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? AI has the potential for huge productivity leaps, like the Industrial Revolution. But the risks of worsening inequality are immense.
How many jobs are we talking about?
The IMF estimates almost 40% of jobs globally are exposed to AI. And it's not just low-skill jobs this time. It's hitting high-skilled, white-collar work, too.
And the impact will be different depending on where you are.
Looks like it. In advanced economies, AI might boost some jobs, making workers more productive, maybe raising wages, but it will definitely automate others, reducing demand, eliminating roles. High-income workers seem best placed to benefit.
What about developing countries?
They might have less direct job replacement initially, but they often lack the infrastructure, the skills base, to really harness AI's benefits. So the risk is the gap between rich and poor countries just gets wider. And within all countries, it's the usual suspects who are most vulnerable. Workers with less education, those in routine jobs, older workers who find it harder to adapt.
So AI acts like a threat multiplier for all those engines of inequality we talked about.
Precisely. Look at the economic engine. AI is a new form of capital. It could massively accelerate Piketty's RG, shifting even more national income away from labor towards capital owners. It could drive huge corporate consolidation, more monopoly power.
Political engine.
The handful of giant corporations dominating AI development will wield enormous economic power. That translates directly into political influence, lobbying for weak regulations, shaping the rules in their favor.
Social engine.
You could see even more rigid class structures. An elite concentrated in AI-powered urban hubs benefiting hugely, and a growing displaced group pushed into precarious, low-paid gig economy work, maybe geographically segregated.
And the ideological engine.
Expect a new version of the meritocracy myth, justifying the hierarchy based on AI readiness or superior intelligence, while conveniently ignoring the structural advantages, access to education, capital, networks that allow some people to thrive in the AI era while others are left behind.
It sounds potentially dystopian. A tech-enforced class system? Is that where we're heading? Is it inevitable?
No, it's crucial to stress that. This trajectory isn't set in stone. But avoiding it requires conscious, proactive, systemic policy choices. We need to recalibrate the whole system.
Okay. So what does that blueprint for mitigation look like? What levers can we actually pull?
There's no single silver bullet, but the sources point to a package of policies working together. First, taxation and redistribution, especially looking again at wealth taxes. Taxes on extreme wealth concentration. Pro, reduces concentration, raises revenue for public services. Con, difficult to implement, potential for capital flight, legal challenges. But there's renewed interest given the scale of inequality now.
Okay, what else? Second, strengthening social safety nets and income support. Things like universal basic income, UBI.
UBI, paying everyone a basic amount.
Yeah. Pro, directly addresses job losses from AI. Could improve health, maybe boost entrepreneurship. Some pilot studies show minimal negative impact on work incentives. Consequent, potentially very high cost, ongoing debate about those work incentives.
Third,
education and lifelong learning. This is huge. Massive investment needed in reskilling, upskilling people throughout their lives. Not just technical skills, but AI complementary skills. Creativity, critical thinking, emotional intelligence, collaboration. Things machines aren't good at.
Makes sense. And fourth,
strengthening worker power. Protecting the right to form unions, bargaining for better wages and conditions, ensuring living minimum wages, maybe even exploring things like worker representation on company boards, giving labor more say in corporate decisions.
And you said these work together,
yeah.
Synergistically. Exactly. They reinforce each other. Imagine using revenue from a wealth tax to help fund UBI and massive investments in education and retraining. The security from UBI gives people the breathing room to actually retrain or take entrepreneurial risks. A better skilled, more adaptable workforce boosts the whole economy. It can become a virtuous cycle, countering the vicious cycle of inequality.
And this all needs to happen alongside environmental sustainability.
Absolutely critical connection. Climate change is an inequality multiplier. It hits the poorest hardest. So any transition to an AI-driven economy must also be a just transition to a green economy. Policies need to tackle both crises together. Think green infrastructure projects that create good jobs, ensuring the costs and benefits of climate action are shared fairly. It's about aiming for that balanced universe the source material mentions. Social and environmental balance together.
Okay. We have covered so much ground. Let's try and wrap this up. The core message, that initial question about why most people are kept within limits, it's really the science of social stratification, isn't it?
It really is. It's about understanding this complex, adaptive, enduring architecture of inequality, how it's maintained by these powerful interlocking engines, economic, political, social, ideological. We've seen how it evolved from the overt systems of the past, slavery, feudalism, caste, early industrialism, into the more subtle but still powerful mechanisms of today. Capital accumulation outpacing growth, elite networks, institutional barriers, and ideologies shifting from divine right to cognitive bias.
And the cost. It's not abstract. It's trillions hoarded while billions live in poverty. It's corroded trust in our societies. And it's those staggering gaps in health, in life itself. The limits are real and they're felt in human bodies, limiting human potential.
Which brings us right back to AI. It stands at this critical juncture. It could be the ultimate threat multiplier, locking in a technologically enforced class system worse than anything before if we just let it rip according to market logic.
It doesn't have to be that way. That same power, those productivity gains, they could be the key. For the first time, maybe, the resources could exist to actually transcend scarcity, to dismantle inequality.
If, and it's a big if we harness it right. If we build a new, equitable social contract around it. Use those gains to fund things like robust income floors, universal access to lifelong learning, a truly just and sustainable economy.
It comes down to choice then, understanding the system, rejecting the justifications, and making deliberate, courageous, systemic, political, and social choices.
Exactly. The source puts it starkly. The technology to build a truly healthy, prosperous, balanced human society exists. The knowledge is there.
So the final provocative thought for you listening, the question isn't really whether we can build a more equitable world anymore. It's whether we have the collective will to do it. What does knowing about this architecture change for you? How you see the news, how you engage in your community, how you think about the structure shaping all our lives? That's something powerful to sit with and something that really demands our attention going forward.
This is DigitView.